It was a Tuesday of the sort that Flaxborough had come to consider quintessentially unremarkable, a thin drizzle over the cobbled market square, the scent of damp wool from washing lines, and a faint undertone of coal smoke from the chimneys. The kind of day that persuaded most residents to keep their opinions and their umbrellas close at hand. Yet, in the otherwise sedate hall of St. Clement's Parish, a minor upheaval was quietly taking shape. The annual committee meeting of the Parish magazine had convened with an attendance that suggested civic duty more than enthusiasm. The committee was a curious assortment: Mrs. Pargeter, matronly and always precise, who carried her spectacles on a chain that clinked like distant church bells; Mr. Evesham, retired solicitor, with a penchant for adjusting his tie, as if each adjustment improved the moral rectitude of the parish; and young Miss Lindley, secretary, who appeared perpetually astonished that adults could conduct business without memos. At the far end, the vicar, a man of unruffled demeanour and persistent tie, presided over the proceedings with the serene authority of one who had long ago mastered the art of nodding in agreement while thinking of tea. Purbright, called in as a formality rather than an expectation, sat quietly at the side, a notebook balanced on his lap, and an expression that suggested he might have been elsewhere entirely, a habit often mistaken for distraction. He listened as the discussion began, ostensibly about subscriptions and article contributions, but the undercurrent, though barely audible, had the tingling edge of anticipation. "Now I would like to propose," said Mrs. Pargeter, her voice carrying just enough firmness to suggest that dissent might be painful, "that we consider the matter of last month's editorial." She glanced around, and every pair of eyes seemed to twitch in recognition of a shared, unspoken discomfort. Mr. Evesham cleared his throat. "The editorial in question," he began cautiously, "contained several passages that, how shall I say, might be interpreted as somewhat irregular, perhaps even misleading." At this, Miss Lindley's pencil hovered in mid-air, as if daring the words to land. Even the vicar adjusted his spectacles, tilting his head as though to catch a suspicious angle of light. Purbright made a small note, not of what was being said, but of the rhythm of hesitation in Evesham's voice, the way Lindley's pen trembled ever so slightly, and the faint but discernible flush on Mrs. Pargeter's cheeks. Behavioural clues, these, are a more telling metric than ink on paper. The discussion unfolded slowly, each committee member contributing a carefully measured phrase, often contradicting themselves in tone while preserving decorum. The alleged irregularity, Purbright discerned, had less to do with content and more to do with subtle commentary on parish finances, phrased with innocuous words that could be read as anything from gentle satire to insubordination. By the time the meeting had stretched toward mid-afternoon, the rain outside had lessened to a persistent drizzle, indifferent to the minor storm within the hall. The vicar's intervention was calm, courteous, and oddly disarming. He suggested a brief adjournment for tea and biscuits, a stratagem that had the immediate effect of dispersing tension while offering Purbright the perfect vantage to observe small-town politics in their native habitat. As cups were filled and biscuits discreetly nibbled, murmurs floated between chairs. Mrs. Pargeter was heard to comment on the impropriety of airing grievances in print. Mr. Evesham expressed a polite but firm concern over public perception, and Miss Lindley, in a whisper only perceptible to Purbright, admitted that she had felt some discomfort at the phrasing of the editorial, though she could not articulate precisely why. Purbright, notebook now closed, observed the interplay with quiet satisfaction. It was remarkable, he thought, how a minor editorial could ignite such an intricate choreography of indignation, worry, and subtle rivalry. The crisis, if it could be called that, was entirely understated yet palpably real. The first spark of what might grow into a scandal had flickered not in grand gestures but in hushed tones, the tilt of a head, the cadence of a sentence. By the time the meeting resumed, no one acknowledged any wrongdoing aloud, and the editorial in question remained on the agenda like a smouldering ember beneath a well-polished tablecloth. Purbright made a final note of the peculiar mixture of civility and tension, the essential ingredients of the sort of trouble that rarely announced itself with fanfare, but often left lasting marks. And so the annual committee meeting concluded in the usual Flaxborough manner without clear resolution, yet with every participant carrying a personal conviction that a small injustice, or perhaps a small scandal, had indeed occurred. Outside, the drizzle persisted, the cobbles glistened with an indifferent shine, and Purbright, quietly intrigued, tucked away his observations for later reflection. Small towns, he mused, held their secrets in whispers, and it was often in the whispers that the true story resided. The morning after the committee meeting, Flaxborough awoke to its habitual combination of drizzle and mild gossip. In the narrow lanes leading from the market square to the parish hall, conversations began as soon as one foot touched the damp cobbles. The editorial controversy, though seemingly trivial to an outsider, had become the town's quiet obsession, and by breakfast every household had its own version of events to report. At Mrs. Hargreaves's tea shop, where the scent of fresh scones mingled with the faint tang of boiled cabbage from the neighbouring houses, patrons exchanged details with the zeal usually reserved for more dramatic misdeeds. "Did you hear about the editorial?" Mrs. Hargreaves asked, setting down a pot of Earl Grey with the precision of a woman accustomed to authority. "They say it questioned the vicar's management of funds, though of course one can never be certain." Across the table, Mr. Tilling, retired headmaster and proprietor of an opinionated chin, leaned forward conspiratorially, questioned, I should say it insinuated, Miss Lindley mentioned as much. "She may be young, but she's sharper than she appears. I wouldn't put it past her to have been subtly aligning herself against the committee." Mrs. Hargreaves blinked. "Surely not Miss Lindley." "Why, she's scarcely ever spoken a word unless prompted." "And the vicar, he'd never permit such an affront, would he?" "That's the point," Mr. Tilling replied with a slow nod, letting the weight of his words hang over the table like a mislaid teacup. "No one dares speak openly, yet everyone feels the need to react. It's all very Flaxborough." As the morning wore on, Purbright made his customary rounds, walking the familiar streets with unobtrusive attentiveness. He noted the slight stiffening of shoulders as shopkeepers nodded in passing, the way Mrs. Fennell arranged her flower display with particular care, and the subtle shift in tone when anyone mentioned the magazine. Each fragment of chatter, each carefully measured glance, offered insight into the town's simmering tension. It was, in essence, gossip elevated to a form of behavioural calculus, and Purbright's mind catalogued it meticulously. By late morning, the postman had unwittingly added fuel to the quiet fire. A letter, received at the vicarage and apparently misdelivered the previous day, contained a complaint from a parishioner over the alleged editorial impropriety. The wording was polite enough. "I hope my concerns will be treated with discretion," yet the subtext suggested indignation and expectation. Within hours, the letter was the subject of whispered discussion in the local grocer's, the haberdashery, and the chemist's shop. Meanwhile, in the vicarage itself, the vicar exhibited a model of equanimity. He read the letter, murmured a few private observations, and returned to arranging his sermons with a faint, almost imperceptible sigh. Mrs. Pargeter called upon him shortly thereafter, ostensibly to discuss the upcoming contributions for the magazine, but her demeanour betrayed a trace of apprehension. Purbright, seated quietly in a corner, observed their exchange with characteristic patience. He noted the slight furrow in the vicar's brow, the careful modulation of Mrs. Pargeter's voice, and the tentative, almost pleading tilt of her head. The narrative that had begun in the hall now took on life in private parlours and over tea tables. Mrs. Crick, whose curiosity was matched only by her propensity to overstate every detail, whispered to her sister-in-law about the editorial's daring phrasing. "I never thought Miss Lindley capable of such subtlety," she confided, "and yet I cannot shake the feeling that she is not entirely innocent." People of her sort always have a hidden motive. Across town at the railway buffet, the station master and a group of habitual morning commuters debated the scandal with the kind of seriousness usually reserved for international affairs. "One wonders if the editorial is really just a cover," suggested Mr. Foster, chewing his toast with deliberate care. "I've known Miss Lindley since she was a child. She is exceedingly polite, yes, but one never really knows what thoughts dwell behind those large eyes. Flaxborough is full of appearances. As the day progressed, small rumours collided, intertwined, and diverged into half-truths, exaggerations, and speculative leaps. A minor argument erupted outside the post office when a delivery boy accidentally misquoted the complaint letter's content. Passers-by gathered momentarily, exchanging opinions with the intensity of magistrates considering a capital sentence. By mid-afternoon, the town's reaction had reached a crescendo that, to Purbright's practised eye, was simultaneously chaotic and coherent lattice of social expectation, suspicion, and misplaced certainty. Purbright, having walked the length of the town square twice, noted how the scandal's perception had evolved in just a few hours. The original committee meeting, once a contained and orderly affair, had multiplied in significance through gossip, hearsay, and the peculiar generosity with which Flaxborough residents embellished the mundane. The very notion of impropriety had shifted from editorial phrasing to character judgment, from private misgivings to public speculation. By evening, the vicar convened a small gathering at the vicarage, inviting committee members and a few select parishioners, ostensibly to discuss forthcoming magazine content and logistics. Yet the true purpose, unspoken yet understood, was to gauge sentiment, to feel the undercurrent of opinion before it reached a point of irreversibility. Purbright, invited as ever with quiet civility, observed the careful exchanges, the subtle hedges of speech, and the almost imperceptible glances that betrayed more than words could convey. As conversation meandered, Purbright noted Mrs. Pargeter's insistence on propriety, the vicar's polite insistence on calm, and Miss Lindley's hesitant clarifications, each layered with the weight of social self-preservation. The room itself seemed to hum with barely restrained speculation, a microcosm of the town outside. And Purbright, notebook closed once more, felt the first true tug of curiosity that would, in the days to come, transform a minor editorial dispute into a mystery worth unravelling. The drizzle resumed outside, the cobbles slick underfoot, and Flaxborough settled into its evening routine. Yet, beneath the polite facades, the town had collectively acknowledged that something unusual had occurred, and the ripples of disquiet would continue to spread. In the silent watch of the vicarage, Purbright reflected that the essence of Flaxborough's intrigue was not in grand events, but in small, understated disturbances that revealed the delicate architecture of social habit. A scandal, he thought, was as much about perception as action, and perception in Flaxborough was rarely straightforward. By the following morning, Purbright had resolved to approach the matter with his customary methodical discretion. The town, as he had observed, had already established a narrative of its own making, somewhat fanciful, partially accurate, and wholly persuasive to the residents who enjoyed the subtle drama of civic life. His role, therefore, was not to disrupt, but to gather the facts in a manner as unobtrusive as the morning mist over the market square. He began with Miss Lindley, whose expression suggested she had spent the night rehearsing possible explanations, and had concluded none were entirely satisfactory. She welcomed him politely into her modest office at the parish hall, offering him a cup of weak tea with the sort of quiet apprehension typical of someone who feared that any word could be misinterpreted. Purbright accepted without comment, merely observing the neat rows of ledgers, the carefully arranged pens, and a single sprig of dried lavender that lent the room a faintly aromatic civility. "I suppose," Purbright began gently, "we should discuss the editorial, if that is convenient." He spoke in a tone that indicated no presumption, merely curiosity, leaving the responsibility of disclosure entirely with her. Miss Lindley hesitated, then sighed softly. "I did not intend any offence," she said. Her voice was firm yet edged with a timidity that suggested the weight of local expectation. "I thought the phrasing might encourage readers to consider the parish accounts more carefully. Nothing more." Purbright nodded slowly. "And yet it seems the committee has interpreted your words otherwise?" He made no comment on their interpretation, instead noting her careful choice of words, the precise modulation of her tone, and the subtle avoidance of eye contact when discussing Mrs. Pargeter's reactions. Behaviour, he thought, often spoke louder than explanation. "Mrs. Pargeter is protective," Miss Lindley continued, a faint blush colouring her cheeks. "She believes the magazine should reflect the parish faithfully, without suggestion of impropriety. I only meant to be thorough." Purbright made a small note, though not of what she said, but of the cadence of admission, the slight pressure with which her fingers rested on the teacup, and the mild tremor in her lower lip. These were the nuances that often revealed far more than words alone. Next, he visited Mrs. Pargeter, who received him in a drawing-room that bore the hallmarks of genteel propriety: floral curtains, polished mahogany, and the faint aroma of recently brewed coffee. She regarded Purbright with a mixture of formality and subtle exasperation. "Inspector, I trust you are not here to judge me," she began. Her voice was clipped, precise, yet there lingered a hint of defensiveness. "Merely to understand," Purbright replied evenly. "It appears there is some concern regarding the editorial." Mrs. Pargeter adjusted her spectacles and inclined her head. "Concern is one word, scandal is another, though in Flaxborough they are often closely related. I maintain that propriety must be observed at all times, and Miss Lindley's phrasing, well, one cannot ignore implication, even if unintended." Purbright observed her carefully, the slight rigidity of posture, the deliberate pacing of her words, and the quick glance toward a painting of the parish church on the wall, as though seeking moral reinforcement. "So your objection," he clarified, "is less to the content itself than to the suggestion it might provoke?" "Precisely," she affirmed. "Perception matters more than mere fact. One cannot be too careful with public trust." From Mrs. Pargeter, Purbright moved on to Mr. Evesham, whose library smelled faintly of old leather and polishing wax. The retired solicitor welcomed him with a polite nod, offering a chair beside a window that overlooked a small, meticulously kept garden. "Inspector, it seems the whole town has taken up this minor point, as if it were a matter of life and death," he said, with a faintly rueful smile. "And yet I suppose there are elements of propriety that must be considered. The editorial, though mildly provocative, is hardly criminal. But Miss Lindley's choice of words one must tread carefully." He spoke with the cautious precision of someone trained to pass nuance in legal documents, and Purbright made note of both the content and the hesitations, the micro-pauses that suggested judgment and private disapproval coexisting uneasily. Having completed these initial interviews, Purbright retired briefly to review his notes. He considered not only what had been said, but the manner of its delivery, the punctuated hesitations, the minor contradictions, and the subtle admissions embedded within seemingly trivial phrases. Flaxborough's scandal was, in essence, a tapestry woven from civility and suspicion, with threads of rivalry, and expectation forming a delicate pattern that only a patient observer could discern. Before concluding his morning, Purbright took a brief walk past the parish hall. The town itself seemed alive with commentary shop windows reflecting conversations. Neighbours lingered at doorsteps, and the postman's rounds offered a constant stream of muttered observations. Every encounter, every glance, seemed to echo the tension that had begun in the committee meeting, now magnified by collective interpretation. By afternoon, Purbright felt he had enough to begin mapping the relationships, the expectations, and the subtle pressures influencing each participant. There was no overt crime, no overt transgression, yet the situation bore the hallmark of what he had learned to recognize in Flaxborough, the quiet escalation of triviality into perceived scandal. Here, as in many such cases, the truth would not announce itself with a flourish. It would emerge through careful observation, discreet questioning, and a sensitive understanding of the social fabric. As dusk approached, he returned to his office, the town lights beginning to glimmer in the damp streets. Flaxborough's normal rhythm continued, outwardly unchanged, yet beneath the surface, currents of concern and curiosity moved with deliberate intent. Purbright allowed himself a faint, private smile. A case, however understated, was beginning to take shape, and it was a rare pleasure to follow its unfolding without haste, savouring the subtleties that would eventually reveal the true nature of the disturbance. By midweek, the quiet ripples of discontent within Flaxborough had begun to converge around a single, seemingly natural focal point. The town, in its habitual manner, had identified a candidate upon whom blame could be comfortably assigned Miss Lindley, the young secretary whose editorial phrasing had sparked the initial unease. To the casual observer, her youth and relative inexperience provided an easy explanation for the perceived irregularity. Among the more garrulous residents, the narrative took on a decidedly accusatory hue, though no evidence beyond words existed to support it. At the post office, where the counter was polished, but the gossip even more so, Mrs. Crick was in mid-conversation with Mrs. Hargreaves. "I suppose it was obvious, wasn't it?" she said, as though the answer required no verification. "Of course, it must have been Miss Lindley. One cannot expect such a young person to grasp the subtleties of propriety." Mrs. Hargreaves inclined her head solemnly, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "And yet she is polite. I have never known her to be otherwise. It seems almost cruel to attribute mischief where there may be none. But Flaxborough does love a tidy story, doesn't it?" Across town, Mr. Evesham's measured disapproval had subtly intensified. He had drafted a brief note to the vicar, emphasizing the committee's concern and the perceived impropriety of allowing a young and inexperienced hand to wield influence over the parish readership. Though careful in language, the note carried the unmistakable undertone of expectation that something must be done, and the sooner, the better. Purbright, observing from his office window, noted the consolidation of opinion with detached curiosity. The town's inclination to identify a single culprit, rather than consider the ambiguity of intent or circumstance, was hardly unusual. Yet he was aware that the ease with which blame had settled on Miss Lindley might obscure subtler truths. There were always layers to be unpicked, and in Flaxborough, the apparent simplicity of a scandal rarely withstood closer scrutiny. He arranged to call on Miss Lindley once more, choosing a time that would allow her to be unhurried. She received him in the parish hall, where the morning light, filtered through lace curtains, cast a gentle glow over the tidy office. Her hands were folded neatly on the desk, a faint tension visible in the tight press of her fingers. "I understand that you have been, shall we say, the focus of considerable attention," Purbright began, adopting his usual tone of unobtrusive inquiry. "How do you find the situation?" Miss Lindley sighed, a mixture of exasperation and embarrassment. "It is difficult. I only intended to be precise, to encourage careful reading and understanding, yet somehow my words have become amplified." "Amplified indeed," Purbright murmured. "Amplification often occurs not through action alone, but through interpretation. And interpretations can be most persuasive when they are repeated frequently." He allowed a pause, observing the way her eyes flickered briefly to the window, avoiding his direct gaze. "You do not seem particularly guilty, though the town's eagerness to assign blame is quite remarkable." "I assure you," she said earnestly, "I would never wish to scandalize anyone, especially not the vicar or Mrs. Pargeter. I am simply bewildered by the attention." Purbright made a small note, not of the words themselves, but of the absence of defensive aggression. Her manner, measured and sincere, suggested anxiety rather than culpability. It was a subtle distinction, yet one that would prove significant. He had often found that the guilty exhibited a different rhythm of hesitation, coupled with self-interest, a timbre of concern that shifted toward concealment. In contrast, Miss Lindley's discomfort arose from social pressure and misapprehension, not malfeasance. Later that afternoon, Purbright visited the vicar, whose calm demeanour remained largely unaltered by the swirling town gossip. In the vicarage, the discussion was framed in polite circumspection. The vicar expressed concern for Miss Lindley's welfare, noting the potential strain of sudden notoriety, and mused on the necessity of guiding youthful enthusiasm without undue criticism. Purbright observed the vicar's careful phrasing, the gentle inflections that suggested both awareness of public perception and an underlying confidence in human decency. "Flaxborough," the vicar remarked, "has an extraordinary capacity for dramatizing the mundane. A misplaced word can become an event of some significance. Miss Lindley's intentions are clearly honourable, yet we must be vigilant in ensuring that interpretation does not become distortion." Purbright nodded, noting that the vicar's insight aligned with his own observations. The focus on Miss Lindley was understandable, yet possibly misplaced. He made a mental note to broaden his inquiries, mindful that the appearance of culpability might be a convenient shield for other motivations less overtly acknowledged. By evening, the town had largely coalesced around the notion that Miss Lindley bore responsibility for the editorial controversy. Conversations in shop, windows at the railway station, and even in the quiet corners of the parish hall reflected the ease with which collective opinion had assigned guilt. Yet Purbright, having observed the interactions and listened to the nuances of speech, recognized the limitations of such assumptions. There was a subtle incongruity, he thought, in the fervour with which the community singled out a single, youthful figure. It was a pattern he had observed before. Towns like Flaxborough often required a neat explanation, a tidy moral arc, even if it defied the underlying complexity of human behaviour. The true nature of the disturbance, he suspected, was not to be found in the young secretary's intentions, but in the interplay of expectation, reputation, and concealed resentment. Walking home through the dimming streets, Purbright reflected that the first obvious suspect was rarely the full story. Flaxborough, with its polite facades and understated rivalries, promised layers yet to be revealed. And as the lamps flickered on along the cobbles, casting long shadows across the rain-slick streets, he knew that the real investigation, quiet, deliberate, and keenly observant, was only just beginning. The following morning, Flaxborough awoke to a mild drizzle, the kind that left the streets glistening, but did nothing to dampen the burgeoning curiosity that had taken hold of the town. For Purbright, the day presented an opportunity to resume his quiet observations, guided by the sense that the smallest detail might reveal more than overt declarations or polite statements ever could. He began with a stroll past the parish hall, noticing immediately the subtle tension in the committee members' demeanours as they arrived. Mrs. Pargeter, impeccably coiffed, nodded briskly to familiar faces while casting fleeting, sharp glances at Miss Lindley, who moved with quiet grace yet bore the unmistakable burden of being the town's chosen scapegoat. Mr. Evesham, meanwhile, lingered near the notice board, pencil in hand, appearing to inspect announcements that had no bearing on the editorial at all. Such posturing, Purbright thought, was often as revealing as direct speech. It suggested the careful maintenance of appearances while monitoring reactions. Inside the hall, as the committee prepared to review upcoming contributions, Purbright's attention was caught by something entirely unrelated to the meeting itself, a small scrap of paper protruding from the edge of a filing cabinet. It was an unremarkable piece of stationery, lightly smudged with ink, as if it had been hastily set aside and forgotten. Yet its placement, partially visible yet conspicuously ignored by those bustling past, intrigued him. He retrieved it discreetly and examined the contents, a brief penciled note reading, "Check the subscriptions for discrepancies." The handwriting was neat, deliberately so, but the initials did not correspond to any of the regular committee members, as far as Purbright could recall. It was trivial in appearance, almost laughably mundane. Yet in Flaxborough he had learned that the most minor anomaly often indicated a quiet disturbance beneath the surface. Something as small as a mislaid note could, when considered alongside human behaviour, hint at intentions not otherwise articulated. He made a careful copy in his notebook, noting the paper's position, the faint crease in its centre, and the slight smudge suggesting someone had handled it while distracted. Purbright did not immediately confront anyone. Instead, he allowed the meeting to proceed, observing interactions with renewed attention. Mrs. Pargeter spoke with measured concern about the editorial's tone, Miss Lindley responded with courteous explanations, and Mr. Evesham provided an occasional, well-timed nod. Yet his mind repeatedly returned to the scrap of paper and its inscrutable initials. Who, he wondered, had left it? And why had it been placed where all could see yet no one commented? By mid-morning he decided to revisit Miss Lindley, ostensibly to discuss the day's schedule, but in reality to observe her natural responses to seemingly mundane events. She welcomed him with the same polite, measured attention as before, though Purbright detected a subtle stiffness, perhaps the lingering awareness of the town's scrutiny. He casually mentioned the note, careful not to suggest suspicion. "I noticed something in the hall," he said lightly, "a small slip of paper. It seemed overlooked. Have you any knowledge of it?" Miss Lindley glanced slightly puzzled, then shook her head. "I'm afraid not, Inspector. I see everything that passes across my desk, and I did not notice such a note. Perhaps someone left it temporarily while attending to other matters." Her tone was sincere, yet Purbright paid close attention to the infinitesimal hesitation that preceded her reply. Not hesitating born of guilt, he judged, but of uncertainty. She was careful, naturally so, and the note was not part of her usual routine. It was, he reflected, precisely the kind of innocuous detail that, if ignored, might mislead an investigator unaware of human nuance. Later, he visited the vicarage, presenting the note as a topic of benign curiosity rather than accusation. The vicar examined it carefully, eyebrows raised in mild surprise, and muttered a quiet observation about the diligence of those involved in magazine production. "It is nothing alarming," he said finally, "but attention to detail is always commendable. It may simply be a reminder of a clerical duty." Purbright accepted this at face value, yet made a note of the vicar's precise phrasing, commendation for diligence, not alarm, subtly acknowledged responsibility without pointing to malfeasance. It was the type of distinction that revealed more about social intention than words themselves. The day continued with Purbright observing the town's rhythms, shopkeepers' polite nods, the casual comment at the butcher's counter, and the cautious whisper of a baker concerned over minor errors in a delivery list. He noted how each resident, knowingly or not, contributed to the pattern of perception surrounding the editorial incident. The small note, trivial as it seemed, became a lens through which the larger picture, subtle tensions, expectations, and potential misdirection could be discerned. By evening, he returned to his office, the streets damp and glistening, the gas lamps casting long, quivering shadows across the cobbles. The scrap of paper, unassuming in its form, had added a layer of intrigue to the investigation. While the town had eagerly settled on Miss Lindley as the first obvious suspect, Purbright's attention to this minor anomaly reminded him that the apparent simplicity of blame rarely equated to truth. A scandal, he reflected, might grow from words, appearances, or even forgotten scraps of paper, and the careful observer, attuned to nuance, could trace the threads that others overlooked. In Flaxborough, where civility concealed ambition and routine masked subtle rivalry, even the most trivial detail demanded attention. He set the note beside his notebook, already imagining the conversations, hesitations, and unspoken motives that it might illuminate in days to come. The morning following the discovery of the scrap of paper, Flaxborough carried on with a semblance of normality, though beneath the surface, the subtle currents of unease had begun to extend beyond the original circle of committee members. Purbright, ever alert to the town's social geography, noted how quickly the periphery of gossip was being drawn into the centre of the emerging scandal. His first stop was the grocer's, where Mrs. Hargreaves was restocking her shelves with the kind of methodical diligence that left one wondering whether the rhythm of arranging canned goods could itself be a form of social commentary. Conversation, of course, strayed quickly to the editorial incident. "It's not only Miss Lindley, you know," Mrs. Hargreaves confided, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "I've overheard the bakers discussing it at breakfast. They think the whole committee might be complicit, if one dares to read between the lines." Purbright allowed himself a faint nod, silently cataloguing the observation. The widening circle of suspicion was a familiar pattern in Flaxborough. When the initial locus of concern was identified, secondary and tertiary participants inevitably emerged, each with their own interpretation, each inadvertently contributing to the cumulative pressure on the perceived source of the trouble. By mid-morning, he made his way to the library, a place where information, like dust, settled silently but could be stirred with the gentlest breeze. There, he encountered Mr. Darlington, the town historian, and occasional pamphleteer, who had already begun preparing a private account of the unfolding events. "It is remarkable," Darlington remarked, arranging a stack of papers with the ceremonial care of a man handling ancient manuscripts, how quickly one minor editorial can implicate an entire network of relationships. There is Miss Lindley, of course, and the committee, but I dare say the ripple effects may touch even those who only read the words in passing. He paused, glancing at Purbright with a mixture of curiosity and mild accusation. People are more easily influenced than they care to admit. Purbright listened, making mental notes of Darlington's phrasing and the subtle pride with which he claimed to observe human behaviour. The historian, while not a formal participant in the magazine committee, wielded influence over perception through his commentary, reinforcing the sense that the town's reaction was a collective, self-perpetuating phenomenon. Encouraged by these observations, Purbright widened his inquiries. He called on Mr. and Mrs. Foster, proprietors of the local bakery, whose interest in the magazine seemed, at first glance, entirely coincidental. Yet their manner suggested more than casual curiosity. There was a faint intensity in their conversation, a desire to assert their own interpretation of events. Mrs. Foster, adjusting her apron, mentioned the editorial in passing, noting the peculiar choice of words and implying delicately that there might be a hidden agenda. Mr. Foster, nodding in agreement, speculated on how the distribution of the magazine, its reach and influence, might affect public perception. The couple's observations, innocuous as they seemed, provided a network of context. Flaxborough's social fabric was tightly woven, and even marginal voices contributed to the emerging narrative. By afternoon, Purbright visited the post office again, where the discussion had now migrated from polite curiosity to tentative theorizing. Mr. Tilling, the retired headmaster, was holding court with a small assemblage of townsfolk, describing the editorial as an almost archetypal example of youthful indiscretion and the perils of misjudged phrasing. Purbright watched the conversation unfold from a corner, noting how the participants responded to each assertion with small nods, quick murmurs of agreement, and occasionally the careful insertion of qualifying phrases. In Flaxborough, opinion was never absolute. It relied on delicate negotiation, a balance of assertion and concession that Purbright observed with quiet satisfaction. The day's inquiries culminated in a visit to the vicar, whose calm demeanour remained unshaken despite the growing web of commentary surrounding the magazine. He spoke of social responsibility, the importance of measured response, and the difficulty of navigating perceptions without unduly constraining free expression. Purbright listened carefully, aware that the vicar's reflections were as much a guide to the town's moral compass as they were an exposition of principle. As the afternoon waned into evening, Purbright took a solitary walk along the cobbled streets, noting the subtle signs of anticipation in the town. Shop windows reflected polite clusters of conversation, neighbours lingered at doorsteps, and the distant chime of the church bell punctuated the otherwise ordinary rhythm of civic life. Every glance, every gesture contributed to the tapestry of human behaviour, revealing concerns and allegiances that words alone might not capture. He returned to his office as dusk fell, the gas lamps casting a gentle amber glow on the wet streets. The field of inquiry had clearly expanded beyond the initial committee and its secretary. Influences, opinions and speculations now encompassed a broader swath of Flaxborough, creating a latticework of expectation, subtle rivalry, and private curiosity. The minor editorial had, almost imperceptibly, become the focal point of a network that touched many lives, none entirely innocuous, and all worth noting. Purbright set aside his notebook and reflected that the expansion of concern, though outwardly chaotic, was in fact orderly in its own social logic. Flaxborough had a way of transforming the smallest disturbance into a complex interplay of perception and reaction, and the skill of a careful observer was to discern the undercurrent of intent amid the surface tumult. There were, he mused, layers yet to explore, motivations yet to reveal, and through it all, the town's appetite for tidy resolutions ensured that each small ripple would continue to generate discussion long after the event itself had passed. That evening, after the town had settled into its familiar rhythm and the drizzle had given way to a thin, cold mist, Purbright found himself alone in his modest office. The soft glow of the desk lamp illuminated the neatly stacked files in his ever-present notebook, the quiet hum of Flaxborough outside serving as both backdrop and reminder of the subtle dynamics he sought to understand. The day's events, culminating in the smudged edition of the Parish magazine, provided ample material for reflection, and Purbright welcomed the opportunity to consider the human elements that so often eluded direct observation. He began by reviewing the interviews and encounters of the past several days. Miss Lindley's measured anxiety, Mrs. Pargeter's insistence on propriety, Mr. Evesham's careful judgments, and the vicar's steady mediation all presented a tapestry of intentions, interpretations, and expectations. Each behaviour, seemingly ordinary in isolation, coalesced into patterns revealing the deeper currents of the town. He noted the precise ways in which civility masked tension, how politeness could serve both as a shield and a probe, and how even the most mundane gestures, a lifted eyebrow, a frown, a sigh, could convey volumes when read attentively. His thoughts returned, inevitably, to the scrap of paper discovered in the parish hall. At first glance it was trivial to write a brief note bearing initials and a prompt regarding subscriptions. Yet, in context, it represented the sort of minute deviation from routine that had the potential to shift perception, raise suspicion, or catalyze anxiety. It was a reminder that Flaxborough's social fabric was finely balanced, and even minor anomalies could generate disproportionate consequences. Purbright considered the delivery boy, Timothy, and his nervous, well-intentioned demeanour. The boy had been forthright, diligent, and consistent in his account of the smudged magazines, yet the incident demonstrated how unintended events could exacerbate existing tensions. Human nature, Purbright mused, had a remarkable capacity for assigning intention where none existed, and communities had an uncanny aptitude for amplifying rumour into certainty. In Flaxborough, appearances were often more compelling than facts, and perception frequently outweighed reality. He reflected on Mrs. Crick's enthusiastic interpretations, the informal analysis conducted by Mr. Darlington at the library, and the private musings of shopkeepers, each of whom contributed to the town's collective understanding or misunderstanding of events. Flaxborough operated like a clockwork of subtle observation. Every tick and tremor in human behaviour set off reverberations that touched the corners of society far beyond the original incident. In this light, the editorial controversy was less a matter of error or misjudgment than a lens through which the town examined itself. Purbright also pondered the motivations of those who had been quick to judge Miss Lindley. Youth, inexperience, and visibility made her an easy target, yet the insistence with which the community embraced her as the source of trouble suggested deeper concerns. Was it simple human desire for a tidy narrative, or did it reflect latent rivalries, unspoken expectations, or subtle anxieties about the management of the parish's public image? Likely it was a combination, a confluence of the pragmatic and the emotional. The smudged magazine, trivial in physical damage yet significant in symbolic weight, further emphasized the limits of superficial observation. While initial attention had focused on human action and intention, this second incident introduced ambiguity, forcing the investigation to account for environmental factors, chance, and misperception. Purbright recognized that the case's resolution would require not only careful scrutiny of behavior, but a patient disentanglement of circumstance from character. He sipped a small cup of tea, noting how the steam twisted lazily upward in the lamp's glow. The town, for its part, would continue to speculate, assigning roles and motives with a fervour that often exceeded the available evidence. Yet his task was different: to observe without intrusion, to discern without accusation, and to weigh subtle contradictions against the cumulative weight of consistent behaviour. It was a practice of patience, requiring attention to minor shifts in expression, tone, and timing, and an understanding that human beings rarely conform to neat moral binaries. In the quiet, Purbright considered the forthcoming steps. The expanded field of concern, the second incident, and the underlying tensions between committee members and parishioners suggested that forthcoming inquiries would need to be subtle, targeted, and attuned to the nuances of perception. There were questions to be asked, scenarios to be gently tested, and reactions to be observed without overt influence. Each participant's response would provide critical insight, revealing where concern arose from innocence, where it was amplified by perception, and where it might mask less obvious motives. As the evening deepened into night, Purbright set aside the day's notes and allowed himself a rare moment of reflection on the nature of small-town intrigue. Flaxborough, with its polite facades and understated rivalries, offered a theatre of human behaviour in which even minor events, an editorial, a smudged page, a misplaced note, could unfold into intricate dramas. Understanding these dramas required more than observation. It demanded empathy, patience, and the quiet recognition that human action was rarely straightforward. Finally, he closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair. The events so far had provided fragments of understanding, a map of intentions and reactions, yet the true nature of the disturbance remained to be revealed. The case would not resolve itself through gossip, assumption, or speculation. It would unfold in the subtleties of behaviour, the imperceptible cues, and the delicate unravelling of social expectation. Purbright, serene in his contemplation, understood that the town's drama was only beginning to reveal its full dimensions, and that the pursuit of truth required measured steps and attentive observation before the first decisive revelation could occur. By the following morning, Purbright resolved to introduce a subtle provocation into the otherwise orderly flow of Flaxborough's social currents. The town, in its eager scrutiny of the Parish magazine scandal, had begun to exhibit patterns of behaviour that suggested more than mere curiosity. There was a rhythm to the gossip, an almost predictable cadence to expressions of concern and opinion. Purbright intended to observe these patterns closely, employing a small, carefully constructed test to gauge reactions and uncover truths not revealed through direct questioning. He chose the parish hall as the setting. Miss Lindley was present, organising the day's correspondence with meticulous attention, while Mrs. Pargeter had arrived early, ostensibly to review draft submissions for the next issue. Purbright arrived quietly, taking a seat near the back, and observed the interactions as if part of the furniture rather than an investigator. The ordinary activity, the shuffling of papers, the quiet consultation over margins, the occasional correction of spelling proceeded as expected, yet he noted the subtle tensions in posture, the tiny hesitations in speech, the almost imperceptible exchanges of glances. Purbright's test was simple. He made a mild, casual remark regarding the editorial in a tone of hypothetical curiosity rather than accusation. "It occurs to me," he said softly, as though pondering aloud, "that sometimes the most diligent contributors are not the ones whose words attract attention, but those whose absence or silence creates the space for interpretation. One wonders how the town perceives each subtle nuance." The effect was immediate, though barely perceptible. Miss Lindley's hand paused mid-envelope, her eyes flickering toward Purbright, then downward, and she straightened slightly as though gathering herself. Mrs. Pargeter's expression shifted, her eyebrows knitting together in a fleeting display of curiosity mixed with subtle apprehension. Both women continued their tasks, yet the rhythm of their actions had changed, minute but distinct. Small adjustments, a rearranged pile of papers, a delayed comment, a cautious glance toward a doorway were the indicators Purbright sought. Human behaviour, he knew, rarely concealed intention completely. He allowed the moment to settle, then introduced a second, more pointed observation, framed as an academic musing rather than interrogation. "I suppose," he continued, "that even a minor alteration in phrasing could affect perception more than one intends. Some might say that interpretation is as powerful as action itself. A misplaced word, an ambiguous sentence can create ripples that extend far beyond the origin." Miss Lindley's lips pressed together briefly, and Mrs. Pargeter's fingers hovered over a margin before returning to her pen. Each hesitation, each subtle shift, provided Purbright with insight into concern, anxiety, and self-perception. The test was working. The responses, though muted, revealed the internal processing of accountability, fear, and propriety in a manner far more informative than direct inquiry could achieve. To further illuminate the situation, Purbright allowed a moment of silence to extend, giving both women time to reflect on the implications of his remarks without adding guidance or pressure. The deliberate stillness encouraged minor behaviours to surface: a small sigh from Miss Lindley, a slight rearrangement of papers by Mrs. Pargeter, a brief, searching glance at the window where the town's quiet streets seemed to watch back. It was in these micro-expressions and unconscious adjustments that the truth of intention and perception became evident. Later in the morning, Purbright engaged the vicar in a similarly gentle manner, discussing hypothetical scenarios involving minor editorial ambiguities and their potential influence on readership. The vicar's responses were calm, analytical, and courteous, yet even he exhibited subtle indicators of thought: a careful pause before each reply, the deliberate choice of words to balance reassurance with observation, and a faint, knowing smile when considering human tendencies toward assumption and exaggeration. By mid-afternoon, Purbright had accumulated a series of observations that suggested a layered understanding of the unfolding situation. Miss Lindley's conscientious anxiety was genuine. Her concern arose from social pressure rather than culpability. Mrs. Pargeter's emphasis on propriety was rooted in her perception of collective expectation, not personal grievance. The vicar's serene mediation reflected both awareness of human fallibility and confidence in the ultimate resolution of misunderstandings. The test had confirmed what he had suspected: the outwardly obvious patterns of blame and concern were complicated by subtle, individual responses that spoke to perception, motive, and propriety in ways that casual observation could not reveal. As the day drew to a close, Purbright made a final round of reflections, noting the gradual dispersal of tension as the participants resumed ordinary tasks. Shopkeepers and townsfolk, informed by morning rumour and private conjecture, had begun to temper their assumptions, allowing minor recalibration of opinion without overt acknowledgement. The town's rhythm, influenced but not dictated by his gentle interventions, returned to a state of measured civility, albeit with a heightened awareness of small irregularities and interpersonal nuance. Walking home through the evening mist, Purbright reflected on the efficacy of the subtle test. By introducing a mild prompt and observing the subsequent behaviour, he had been able to distinguish genuine concern from performative anxiety, conscientiousness from opportunistic posturing, and inadvertent error from deliberate misrepresentation. Flaxborough's social web, delicate and intricate, had revealed its contours not through direct confrontation, but through the careful reading of expressions, gestures, and hesitation. He returned to his office, notebook in hand, prepared to catalogue the day's observations. The test had provided clarity, yet it had also highlighted the layers of subtlety that would need to be unravelled before a definitive understanding could emerge. In the quiet of his study, with the town's street lamps casting reflections on the damp cobbles, Purbright felt a familiar sense of anticipation that the investigation was advancing, the characters' true dispositions were slowly revealing themselves, and the moment of revelation, while still distant, was approaching with measured certainty. By the following morning, the atmosphere in Flaxborough was poised between anticipation and quiet apprehension. The town had taken its measure of the unfolding scandal, and the minor disturbances in Miss Lindley's editorial phrasing, the smudged magazine, the mysterious scrap of paper had coalesced into a topic of polite yet insistent speculation. Purbright, however, knew that the resolution would not be found in conjecture or collective opinion. The truth, as always, lay in observation, timing, and the careful interpretation of human behaviour. He arranged for a small gathering at the parish hall, inviting Miss Lindley, Mrs. Pargeter, Mr. Evesham, and the vicar. The space was prepared with quiet formality chairs aligned in a semicircle, the faint aroma of polished wood and tea, and the usual hum of the town beyond the windows. Purbright, seated at the edge, allowed the participants to settle before initiating the discussion. "Thank you for coming," he began, his voice calm and measured. "We have observed much in the past week, concern, speculation, and interpretations that have, naturally, varied in emphasis. It is time to review the facts as they appear and to consider the motivations behind them." He paused, allowing the weight of the statement to settle. The assembled group shifted slightly, their eyes alert, anticipating clarification. "First," Purbright continued, "the editorial phrasing that has caused some disquiet was composed entirely by Miss Lindley. Its content, though perhaps suggestive to a careful reader, was the product of conscientious effort. She intended to ensure clarity and engagement, not to imply any mismanagement or impropriety. Her motives, therefore, are beyond question." Miss Lindley exhaled softly, her shoulders relaxing, though Purbright observed the residual tension in her fingers and the slight tilt of her head, indicating relief tempered by continued apprehension. "Second," he said, lifting the smudged copy of the magazine, "we observed what might have appeared to be deliberate interference. Yet, upon careful examination of distribution routes, environmental conditions, and minor handling errors, it is apparent that the smudging was accidental. The effect was unfortunate, but it resulted from a combination of damp weather and the handling of the copies by volunteers unfamiliar with the fragility of the ink. No person acted with malice or intent." Mrs. Pargeter nodded, a faint acknowledgement of relief mixed with lingering concern over perception. "So it was not what she began, not a deliberate act," Purbright confirmed, "merely circumstance exacerbated by timing and interpretation. The town, naturally, sought an explanation, and in doing so, assigned responsibility where none was due." He then addressed the scrap of paper that had first drawn his attention. This note, bearing initials not corresponding to any committee member, was discovered in the hall. Investigation revealed that it was a clerical reminder from a volunteer temporarily assisting with subscriptions. The initials AE belonged to a gentleman from the parish council who had undertaken the minor task without informing the committee. The paper's placement, while conspicuous, was entirely innocuous, an artifact of human routine rather than evidence of intention. The vicar leaned forward slightly, fingers folded. "It seems the truth is far simpler than the implications suggested." "Indeed," Purbright replied. "Yet simplicity can be deceptive. The town's eagerness to identify a single responsible party, to create a narrative, is understandable but often misleading. In this case, the first obvious suspect, Miss Lindley, was innocent of any wrongdoing. The reactions of Mrs. Pargeter, Mr. Evesham, and the broader community, while well-intentioned, were influenced by assumptions, appearances, and the natural desire for order. Mr. Evesham, who had been quietly attentive throughout, allowed a faint smile. It is remarkable how easily human perception can be swayed, even in a town as measured as Flaxborough. Purbright inclined his head slightly. And yet the very mechanisms of perception, concern, speculation, and interpretation are also what allow us to discern subtle truths. By observing behavior, noting hesitation, and interpreting actions in context, one can distinguish between appearance and intention. It is in the combination of minor details, gestures, inflections, and seemingly trivial objects that the full story is revealed. He glanced around the room, allowing each person to absorb the explanation. In summary, there was no scandal in the sense of impropriety or malice. There were minor disturbances, human concern, and natural consequences amplified by circumstance. The town's reaction, though understandable, was misdirected in focus. awareness, patience, and careful observation reveal that the integrity of the magazine and of those who produce it remains intact. A soft, collective exhale filled the room. Miss Lindley's eyes brightened, and Mrs. Pargeter's fingers relaxed from their habitual tension. The vicar offered a quiet nod of approval, and even Mr. Evesham's measured demeanour softened with a trace of satisfaction. Purbright allowed the silence to linger, recognizing that closure, once verbalized and observed, required no further embellishment. As the group dispersed, there was a renewed civility in their interactions, a subtle recalibration of perception. The town outside would continue to murmur, of course, but within this small gathering, understanding had been restored. The narrative, once amplified and distorted, now reflected the reality of intention, circumstance, and perception. Purbright, returning to his office after seeing the group off, allowed himself a rare private smile. The threads of minor intrigue had been traced, the behaviours observed, and the subtle cues interpreted. Flaxborough had demonstrated its typical aptitude for elevating the mundane into the remarkable, and yet, as always, careful attention had preserved clarity and truth. Sitting at his desk, notebook open, he reviewed the day's conclusions. Each layer of misunderstanding, each ripple of gossip, and each minor anomaly had been accounted for. The case, though understated, had revealed the complex interplay of human behaviour, perception, and circumstance that so often defined the town's quiet dramas. And in that clarity, Purbright found the satisfaction of resolution achieved not through confrontation, but through observation, patience, and the gentle illumination of truth. In the days following Purbright's careful revelation, Flaxborough returned to its customary rhythm, yet with subtle changes that only a keen observer might note. The town's routine shopkeepers opening shutters in neat rows, the vicar walking through the square with the faintly lifted chin, neighbours greeting one another with the expected combination of civility and curiosity, continued unchanged on the surface, but the air carried a quiet, altered quality. A minor scandal had passed through, leaving behind the faint trace of shared reflection and renewed attentiveness to both words and action. Miss Lindley, for her part, resumed her duties with a mixture of relief and lingering self-consciousness. She moved among her correspondence and editorial tasks with the familiar meticulousness, though now each decision was informed not only by conscientious care, but by the knowledge that the town's attention, even if mild, could transform intention into rumour. Yet she bore this awareness with dignity. Her initial anxiety had settled into a steady, thoughtful diligence that inspired quiet admiration among colleagues who had previously viewed her as merely young and capable. Mrs. Pargeter, too, reflected the subtle influence of Purbright's intervention. Her insistence on propriety remained, as was fitting for her nature, but it was tempered with a newly observed tolerance for minor imperfection. She moved through the parish hall with measured composure, correcting errors where necessary, yet offering a gentler tone to those who erred unintentionally. Even the vicar remarked in passing, during an afternoon meeting, on the apparent lightening of her step and the softened edge of her observations. Civility, Purbright noted, had expanded its reach without diminishing authority, a delicate balance achieved through understanding rather than admonition. The broader town, ever eager to incorporate new narrative threads into daily conversation, had absorbed the resolution with a mix of polite acknowledgement and discreet amusement. At the grocer's, Mrs. Hargreaves spoke of the magazine episode in hushed tones, framing it as a lesson in observation and human frailty. One learns to be cautious, not only with words, but with assumptions, she remarked to a small circle of listeners, whose nod suggested both comprehension and an appreciation for the small drama. The railway station, too, witnessed murmured reflections on perception and error, punctuated by the occasional wry smile at the ease with which the community had embraced a tidy narrative. Purbright, observing these developments from his office window, allowed himself a measured satisfaction. The case, while devoid of criminal intrigue or overt wrongdoing, had illuminated the intricate web of expectation, perception, and minor rivalry that defined Flaxborough. He noted the careful modulation of voices in conversation, the subtle adjustments in body language, and the restrained enthusiasm with which residents shared their interpretations, behaviours that in sum formed a landscape of human conduct as intricate as any criminal investigation. In private reflection, he considered the chain of events in its entirety: the editorial's innocuous phrasing, the town's initial fixation on Miss Lindley, the accidental smudging of the magazine, and the discovery of the scrap of paper. Each element, while minor in isolation, contributed to a cascade of perception and reaction that had produced a genuine, if understated, scandal. Yet through patience, observation, and gentle intervention, the situation had been clarified, with misunderstanding transformed into awareness rather than resentment. The parish hall itself, once the centre of anxious speculation, resumed its function as a hub of civic engagement. Meetings proceeded with the usual combination of diligence and mild politeness, punctuated by carefully chosen words and deliberate gestures. Miss Lindley's confidence, tempered by experience, allowed for smoother interactions, while Mrs. Pargeter's measured oversight ensured that decorum and propriety remained intact. Even the vicar, whose serene guidance had served as an anchor throughout the ordeal, observed a subtle increase in attentiveness among those around him, as if the episode had reminded the town of the value of thoughtful participation. Purbright, meanwhile, returned to the quiet tasks of paperwork and observation, reflecting on the patterns revealed by the episode. The interplay of human behaviour, social expectation, and minor disturbances provided lessons both practical and philosophical: vigilance in observation, patience in interpretation, and an appreciation for the ways in which small details, gestures, words, even an overlooked scrap of paper could illuminate character and intention. It was, he noted, a microcosm of Flaxborough itself, a community governed by civility, yet shaped by subtle rivalries, perceptions, and a readiness to assign meaning where none might exist. As dusk fell over the market square and the faint glow of gas lamps shimmered on wet cobbles, Purbright allowed himself a final quiet smile. The town, having survived its brief distraction, now carried forward a heightened awareness, a small but significant shift in collective understanding. The scandal had passed, leaving only traces of reflection and the gentle reaffirmation of propriety, observation, and shared experience. He closed his notebook, noting the satisfaction that comes from resolution achieved without drama or recrimination. The town's routines, outwardly unchanged, had absorbed the lessons of the week subtly yet effectively, and as the evening deepened, he permitted himself the rare luxury of reflection. Flaxborough, for all its civility and understated rivalry, had revealed itself once more to a patient observer, its secrets, motivations, and intentions laid bare through the gentle art of watching, listening, and understanding. The week drew to a close with Flaxborough resuming its familiar cadence, yet beneath the town's measured exterior the subtle ripples of reflection lingered. Shops opened and closed on schedule, the vicar passed through the square with his customary serenity, and neighbours exchanged polite greetings, tinged with the aftertaste of curiosity now tempered by understanding. Purbright, however, recognised that the narrative threads had not simply dissipated. They had been subtly rewoven, each strand aligned with clarity, observation, and gentle moral reconciliation. He convened a final meeting in the parish hall, inviting Miss Lindley, Mrs. Pargeter, Mr. Evesham, and the vicar, though he allowed them to enter with the casual air of routine rather than anticipation. The hall, washed in the soft glow of afternoon light, seemed smaller somehow, more intimate a stage upon which civility and subtle social calibration could play out. Purbright began deliberately, speaking in his measured, unobtrusive tone. We have observed much in recent days, behaviours, reactions and interpretations, all of which have contributed to the perception of a scandal. Yet it is time to consider the sequence in its entirety, to place each event in context and illuminate the true dynamics at work. He turned first to Miss Lindley. Your editorial, while perhaps stimulating unexpected attention, was composed with conscientious intent and without desire to mislead or provoke. Your diligence is evident, and the misinterpretation arose not from malice, but from circumstance and the interpretive habits of the town. Her relief was visible in the subtle easing of her posture and the softening of her gaze, though she remained poised and thoughtful. He held up the smudged copy of the magazine. This second incident, the running of ink across pages, was entirely accidental. Environmental factors, the handling of copies by volunteers unfamiliar with the fragility of the printing, and simple misfortune conspired to produce a blemish. There was no deliberate action, no hidden motive. Understanding this allows us to distinguish between coincidence and intention, a distinction too often overlooked. Purbright then addressed Mrs. Pargeter. Your concern for propriety and public perception was justified, yet, as we have observed, even measured oversight can be amplified in a town attuned to nuance. Your guidance, rooted in care and civility, has been a stabilizing influence, not a source of reproach. Mrs. Pargeter inclined her head, a gentle acknowledgment passing across her features, the faintest hint of a smile softening her habitual precision. Turning finally to Mr. Evesham and the vicar, summarized the broader lessons of the week. Flaxborough, like many communities, has a capacity to amplify minor events into narratives of significance. Interpretation, rumour, and perception intertwine to create what appears superficially as scandal. Yet careful observation, attention to detail, and consideration of human intent reveal a far simpler reality. The town's collective concern, though understandable, was misdirected, no malfeasance occurred, and no intention of impropriety existed. A pause followed, allowing each person to absorb the explanation. There were no theatrics, no dramatic revelations, simply a gentle unfolding of the truth, articulated with patience and clarity. The subtle cues of expression, gesture, and attentiveness had guided Purbright's deductions, and now the participants themselves recognized the resolution in the quiet alignment of perception with fact. Miss Lindley's lips curved slightly, a faint smile of quiet relief and renewed confidence. Mrs. Pargeter's shoulders relaxed, and Mr. Evesham's measured nod conveyed the satisfaction of understanding rather than judgment. The vicar, serene as ever, permitted himself a discreet acknowledgment of closure, a tacit affirmation that civility and reflection had restored equilibrium. Purbright observed the room, noting how human behaviour, even in small, ostensibly mundane affairs, could conceal complexity and subtlety. The case, though lacking the drama of overt crime, had revealed the intricate interplay of perception, intention, and social expectation. Flaxborough had provided a tableau of civility, rivalry, and conscientiousness that only careful observation could decode. As the group dispersed, the atmosphere was transformed not by grand gestures but by a quiet realignment of understanding. Conversations would continue, of course, as townsfolk interpreted events in their own terms, yet the underlying truth had been clarified. Misinterpretation had been replaced by awareness, apprehension by comprehension, and suspicion by measured consideration. Purbright returned to his office, closing the door with the deliberate calm of one accustomed to reflection. The streets outside glimmered under a soft rain, the familiar cadence of market life resuming. In the notebook before him, he made a final entry, cataloguing the events, observations, and subtle behaviours that had informed his deductions. The threads of minor intrigue had been traced, the behaviours understood, and the town's quiet equilibrium restored. Flaxborough, serene in its civility, yet enriched by the understanding that even small events could reveal the texture of human behaviour, had absorbed the lessons of the past week. And in the gentle art of observation, patience, and unobtrusive guidance, Purbright recognized once more the satisfying clarity that comes when human nature, perception, and circumstance converge into understanding.